Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us tonight for our workshop on disability awareness. My name is Nichelle Wilson, Neighborhood Training and Development Program Manager with the City of Charlotte in the Community Engagement Division. We thank you all for joining us. We know, I'm sure everyone's had a long day, but this is a really important topic and we want to make sure that we get information out to everyone. We are joined tonight by Samantha Nevins, and Samantha is the Executive Director for Disability Rights and Resources. And we are also joined by Marty Mauser. Probably messed that up, Marty. And Marty is the Advocacy Coordinator with Disability Rights and Resources. So they've joined us tonight to share some information about the work that they do and how they support individuals and businesses to help make Charlotte and surrounding areas a more inclusive community. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. This is being recorded. And so this training will be made available to you all on our training on demand site. And I'll put the link in the chat box. And that will be available in about 2 weeks. So you all can revisit this presentation. And also at any time, if you have a question, feel free to type your question either in chat or in Q&A, and then we'll talk about the questions towards the end of the presentation. Please feel free to ask questions. This is all about educating you all, and we want to make sure that you get the most out of the workshop tonight. So without further ado, I will turn over to Samantha and Marty.
Okay, thank you, Nichelle. Hello, everyone. As Nichelle mentioned, my name is Samantha Nevins, and I'm the Executive Director of Disability Rights and Resources. I am here with my Advocacy Coordinator, Marty Musser, and tonight we are going to lead you through a training that we are often asked to do out in the community. In addition, we do this training for schools, businesses, consumers with disabilities, families, clubs, organizations, companies, you name it. So it's a pretty enjoyable and practical presentation, but I think if nothing else after the presentation concludes, feel free to ask us questions, chat questions along the way. So before I get started though, I will do something that is very important to the work that we do, as you will soon learn. All of our meetings that we host, we want to make sure they are as accessible and as inclusive as possible. So an easy thing that we suggest to people who hold Zoom and other virtual meetings is to, in addition to introducing yourself verbally, to describe what you look like in case there are folks in the audience who are blind or low vision. So for those of you who might not be able to see me on the screen today, I am a middle-aged Caucasian woman. I'm sitting in my home office with the background blurred, but I have my red hair up in a top knot bun. I have tortoise glasses on and red lipstick and a white, I'm in a white sleeveless top. Marty, would you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, good evening, everybody. Sorry, I have a couple cats who you might see tonight, but I am a white woman in my 30s. I have long, straight brown hair. I'm wearing a light blue sweater tonight and a little gold necklace. I'm coming to you from my home office. There are a couple bookcases behind me and a large houseplant.
Thank you. So just kind of modeling here, a real easy way that right from the start, you can make a meeting that is virtual become more inclusive to those with disabilities. And for those on the phone who might not have access to a camera. So again, we're happy to be here. We represent Disability Rights and Resources, and tonight we're going to talk to you about disability awareness. Go ahead, Marty, next slide. So our agency, Disability Rights and Resources, is a 501c nonprofit, and we are what is called a Center for Independent Living. And I'll tell you 4 main things which make a Center for Independent Living a Center for Independent Living. So we are consumer controlled. We do not have patients, clients, etc. We have consumers, and our consumers happen to be folks with disabilities. And when we say we are consumer controlled, this means that our consumers, 51% of our staff and our board of directors, because we're a nonprofit, the board of directors have a disability. So I myself have a hidden disability, staff members have disabilities of all kinds. And then our board of directors, 51% of our board of directors, have a disability. So this is one of the most unique things about our agency, but this is a major tenet of a Center for Independent Living. So we are consumer control, and we call that consumer control. Ultimately, the consumer from start to finish is in control of their life and their independent living journey. We are community-based. So as a Center for Independent Living, we are embedded in the communities we serve. We happen to serve 4 counties, Mecklenburg being the largest. We also serve Cabarrus, Union, and Gaston County. And I'll explain a little bit more about our services as we go along. But we are embedded in the community. We work with community leaders, community businesses, municipalities, and we serve the residents who live in those communities. We are non-residential. Despite our title, Center for Independent Living, no one actually lives here. Everybody that we serve lives independently out in the community. And we are cross disability. And this is something that if you've not heard of the Center for Independent Living, this is something else that's unique about the work that we do. We serve all disabilities. So not just people who are blind and low vision, people who are deaf and hard of hearing, folks who have, our consumers might have intellectual or developmental disabilities, mental health disabilities, obvious physical disabilities, or hidden disabilities. So we run the gamut of disabilities, unlike many other disability-specific agencies, such as Metrolina Association for the Blind. They serve a purpose, and that purpose is to assist folks who are blind or low vision, but we do that as well. We serve those folks as well as many others who have a disability. Next slide, Marty. Some of our core services include advocacy, both systems and individual advocacy. As I mentioned, Marty is our advocacy coordinator. So she works with a variety of individuals who have a disability to make sure they know their rights, whether it's going to the doctor, visiting places of businesses, employment, etc. So Marty handles our self-advocacy department as well as the systems advocacy we do. And systems advocacy, just fancy way of saying policy change, policy implementation, legislative work, etc. We offer peer mentoring out of our center. This is something else that makes us unique. We have persons on staff who have a disability who help other folks with a disability to have that shared life experience, that lived experience with their disability as they set goals for living independently. We provide training and assistance so that our consumers can either become independent and live on their own, or they can improve their skills and maintain their independence as they go through life. So independent living skills, the biggest one that comes to mind is travel training. We have a program where we partner with the city bus, and so the CATS buses and transportation system. We train individuals who want to be able to get to and from work, who maybe don't drive, who get to and from work, to enjoy social activities, to go out and explore the city, be with their friends and family. And so we provide one-to-one travel training to adults and youth who are getting ready to begin their independent lives outside of their, family. We also provide transition, and this would be out of a nursing home or a facility for adults and for youth. We also have a really strong information and referral department, which is just as it sounds. People will call us, they have questions. We have trained staff available to answer their questions, provide them with resources, and point them in the right direction if it's something that we can't do at our agency. So contrary to our name, we're Disability Rights and Resources, but we do not help folks file for disability assistance at our office. We do not provide direct services at our office through our information and referral department. However, we do our best to connect the consumers who call in with those resources by through partnerships with other agencies in the community. Next. And so just to kind of wrap up with a nice little bow, what I have just introduced to you as a Center for Independent Living is this really cool kind of infographic video that we've had great success in really helping people get the big concept, the big picture of what we do as an agency. So turn up your volume if you have it, enable your captions, and Marty's going to play this really neat video that will summarize what we do as an agency.
What is a Center for Independent Living? A Center for Independent Living, you can call it a CIL for short, is a unique organization that assists people with disabilities in achieving and maintaining independence. The function of a CIL, though, is often misunderstood. So let's take a look at how a CIL actually works and what makes it different from other types of services. At a CIL, the people we work with are consumers, not clients or patients. This is different from case management, where clients are often told what to do, or from doctors who, in general, diagnose conditions and prescribe treatments. We believe that people with disabilities themselves can make the best decisions for their own care and lives. So at a CIL, consumers with disabilities choose the services and assistance they want that will give them the skills, resources, and opportunities needed to live life independently, just like everyone else. And because 51% of the staff and board of directors of a CIL are people with disabilities, the people making the decisions, running the programs, and sitting on the board can understand and relate to the consumer's needs. This model provides a level of peer support, consumer control, and expertise not found elsewhere. But providing services isn't enough, because historically, people with disabilities have been treated unfairly, marginalized, and face discrimination and negative attitudes. A CIL also works to shift the perception of disabilities to something ordinary and acceptable, something positive, and a part of life. This includes striving to change laws that will even the playing field, making sure that people with disabilities have the same access to public places as well as work opportunities and life choices as everyone else. The focus of a CIL is on changing the system rather than fixing the person. Ultimately, a Center for Independent Living is a living, breathing representation of independent living philosophy. To learn more, watch the video, What is Independent Living Philosophy?
All right, thank you, Marty.
What is a Center for
So hopefully that summarized what I introduced to you as what our agency does on a daily basis. If you want more information, we have some resources at the end of this presentation. If you're curious, of course, we can answer any questions as well. But let's keep rolling along. So we have found in doing this presentation is that It's often helpful to define disability. The work that we do is under the premise and the law, Americans with Disabilities Act. So this definition of disability is the one in which we operate under. So the Americans with Disabilities Act defines disability as a substantial limitation to one or more major life activity. It also includes protection for someone with a history of a disability. So maybe you had a disability, but you don't have it now. Someone who is associated with a person who has a disability, and someone who is perceived as having a disability, even though they don't. So this is the working definition of a disability as we operate from within, and kind of, again, we'll shape the presentation for tonight. Next. Demographics of disability. I always like to say, look around. Everyone you know probably has some disability. They may not know they have a disability, or they may not consider themselves to have a disability, but based on this definition that I just read to you of a disability, there are many types of disabilities and many ways that a disability can significantly impact one or more life activities. So just to give you the facts and the stats, 61 million adults in the US have a disability. 26% of the US population, so 1 in 4, have a disability. And I like to break down disability, break this down by functional disability type. So as you can see, the majority of disabilities are the ones we might think of that, you know, are the mobility disabilities. Someone in a power chair, someone in a manual wheelchair, someone with a walker, etc. Almost 11% have a cognitive disability, as per these statistics. 6.8% have a disability where an independent living, you know, their independent living is affected. So this means they have a difficulty running an errand independently. Okay, let me back up just a minute. Mobility definition, another way to think of it is someone who might have a serious difficulty walking up the stairs or climbing the stairs. A cognition or cognitive disability, they might have serious problem or challenge in concentrating, remembering, or making, you know, simple decisions. Independent living, I mentioned, difficulty running errands unaccompanied. 5.9% of the disabilities, the functional disabilities, are hearing, followed by 4.6% for vision. So that's blind or low vision. For hearing, it's deafness and hard of hearing. And then self-care. These are taken from the CDC website. So if you were curious, we put the link down below. But functional disability that would relate to self-care would be difficulty bathing or dressing oneself. Next, Marty. And the last, you know, kind of statistical part of disabilities, before we get into the fun disability awareness part, is that disability can become more prevalent as we age. So 2 in 5 adults over the age of 65 have a disability. And we know just from living and going about our lives that the population is getting older and older. This means that people are living longer. People who might have had their life cut short by a disability are able to live even longer. So that's an even longer time of living independent. And the disability is the only subset of the population that anyone can become a member of at any time. So some people have had their disabilities since birth. Some people age into them. Some people have an accident and become disabled. So it really does not discriminate. Important also to remember that though some disabilities are readily apparent, most are not visible. As I mentioned when I introduced myself, I happen to have a hidden disability. So if you met me, you wouldn't know that I have a disability unless I said something, but the disability I have does impact my life and my lifestyle. So just important to remember, and you'll hear Marty say this again, disability is not a monolith. Okay, so what works for one person or one way their disability affects them is different for another person, and the way we think about disability can't be the same for everyone, and it isn't the same. One thing we like to say in a Center for Independent Living or within the independent living movement and philosophy is it depends. So perspective, you know, and evaluate everything on a case-by-case basis. So that's kind of where I'll leave off on that. And now I will turn it over to Marty to really kind of dive into the next section of our presentation.
Thank you, Samantha. So let's talk a little bit more about hidden and invisible disabilities. I am proud to disclose I also live with some hidden disability myself. But so just to give you a couple examples of what that can mean. So this is going to include all psychiatric disabilities or mental health conditions. It can also be things like a traumatic brain injury, something like epilepsy, HIV or AIDS, diabetes, chronic fatigue syndrome, or learning disabilities. So basically just anything you're not going to see at first glance and immediately recognize as disability. And this encompasses so many more people than I think most of us think. So that, just to give you an idea, this is a very limited list. This is an endless list of things that can be considered hidden disabilities. But so let's talk about interacting. Our goal with this presentation, it can be titled a lot of different things. We've used disability awareness tonight, but sometimes this kind of training is also called disability etiquette or disability 101. I'll tell you, one of my favorite titles I've seen is demystifying disability. And that is our goal tonight, is just to take some of the mystery out of disability. I think when we're speaking about any marginalized groups, you know, all of the othering that we tend to do is just because we don't know what other people's experiences are. So our goal and our hope is that you will learn a little bit more about disability and feel more comfortable when you have to interact with people with disabilities. So on this slide, you see an image on the right that says, just ask. This is my golden rule when it comes to interacting with people with disabilities. So, you know, introduce yourself. It's really important to always speak directly to the person, not their companion or an assistant or an interpreter. You know, a lot of times when we're talking about older adults, or this is true for anybody with a disability, there's a tendency to want to speak to, you know, maybe their adult child or their parent or their family member. It's important to speak to the person, even if that person has perhaps a disability that impacts their communication. You know, make a point as much as you can to look at them in the eye while you're speaking to them. And so along the lines of just ask. If you want to provide assistance, just ask first. You know, the real world example that this makes me think of is, especially here in the South, you know, we're very courteous, and we love to, if we see someone struggling with the door, you know, come up behind and open it for them. With physical assistance of that nature, I'll say it's important to ask for a couple different reasons. The main one, I think, is that sometimes you can potentially, you know, someone could fall, or I know a couple people who use wheelchairs, and, you know, opening heavy doors, even if it might look a little difficult, you know, from an outsider's perspective, that's actually a really important part of how they're keeping up their strength every day. And they want to do that themselves, even if it looks like it might be difficult. But so if ever you want to provide any kind of assistance, you know, just say, hey, you know, can I give you a hand with that? Sometimes people will say no. So be prepared for that. Don't take it personally. Give them the benefit of the doubt that there are reasons behind them declining assistance. Okay, and so this slide is titled, Don't Make It Awkward. I feel like when we get these interactions wrong, more often than not, it's because we in our own heads are just overthinking, the interaction, or we trip over our words and get really, worried about the way we say things. So just a couple, kind of tips and tricks. They're all don'ts on this particular slide, so we'll go through them. First, don't draw unnecessary attention to the person's disability or the fact that you are assisting them. Just make it a normal interaction like you would have with any other person. Don't be overly helpful. So this is what we were talking about on that last slide. Extend the offer of help by asking, and then accept when someone declines. Trying to do things for the person or insisting on trying to help can come across as patronizing. This is a big one, this next one. Don't use a special voice as if you are speaking to a child. Some of these might seem obvious, but I'll tell you, like they happen all the time. So it's good to be aware of these things. Also, don't repeat yourself in a louder voice always if the person doesn't understand. Certainly, if it's an individual who you know to be hard of hearing, then raise your voice, repeat yourself. But I watch people do this when they're interacting with blind people, for example, in a way that it blows my mind a little bit, to be honest. So speak up if appropriate, but try rephrasing your statement or question, or use more simple language. I see this to be especially important in a lot of professional circles. Sometimes, based on what our line of work is, we can use a lot of jargon that anyone who's not in that line of work wouldn't understand, never mind if they have a disability or not. But sometimes being really intentional about using plain language and restating things perhaps in a simpler way can be really effective. And this last one, don't overthink words like walk or run or see. Just speak normally as you would with a customer or anyone you're interacting with. Sometimes we use this training for businesses, so apologies that I didn't change that word. But so with these words that we can overthink, so what I mean when I'm saying this is, if you're talking with someone in a wheelchair and you might say, hey, do you want to go run across the street and grab a cup of coffee? I promise you that person is not going to be fazed by using a word like walk or run. Similarly, I have some friends who are blind, and I might ask them on occasion, like, hey, have you read this book or have you seen this film? This is not something that these people are hung up on. People who are blind or have low vision, there are a couple different ways that they can read books, and movies and whatnot. So, just don't worry too much about this type of thing, and just be yourself and, speak normally. Okay, so the next couple slides are very disability specific. So we will start out here by talking about people who use wheelchairs. Just as an aside, so as much as you can, try to use terminology like someone who uses a wheelchair or a wheelchair user, as opposed to saying someone who is bound or confined to a wheelchair. I want to be really clear that using a wheelchair is a choice that a person makes. And wheelchairs give people independence and enable them to go out into the world and do the things they want to do. So it's a pet peeve of mine, those terms, confined to a wheelchair. I have yet to meet anyone who uses a wheelchair who is chained to it and literally confined. But so just a couple things to know when you're interacting with someone who uses a wheelchair. Respect the wheelchair as part of someone's physical space. And so what this means is don't lean on it or, touch it or grab one of the handles sometimes if there's a handle on the back. And also, try to be mindful to get on eye level with them. A lot of time, if you're gonna exchange more than a sentence or two, if there's a way that you can, take a seat so that you're at eye level with that person, that is a respectful way to interact with them. If you can imagine for yourself, if you were to have long extended conversations with people where you have to look up the entire time, that can get really uncomfortable really quickly. And then similarly, just kind of be conscious of the environment and of any architectural barriers. So if you're walking and talking with somebody, naturally, if the path you're on will veer to stairs or a ramp, I would suggest taking the ramp so you can continue, your conversation and interacting together.
Marty, if I can jump in, because I have an interesting example, anecdotal thing that I always share when we talk about someone who uses a wheelchair and kind of being respectful to go to eye level. My family used to go to school with the very famous couple from The Little Couple on TLC, and the children of the little couple, they are little people, and they did this big sensitivity training for the school that my children went to, as not to make a big deal, when this family was coming to school. And they made some, modifications to the classroom environment. But what they didn't think of, and they told us all, treat them normally. But I recall when there was a parent night, and Dr. Jen Arnold, who is a she's a physician at the local children's hospital where I used to live. She's going around for hours at this parent night, and she had been craning her neck up to talk to everyone for hours, all because the school had prepared us to not make a big deal over their size and so forth. But she flat out asked, would you mind, to a group of teachers, would you mind please, crouching down so that I can have a conversation with you? It is uncomfortable for me to look up for an extended period of time. Now, someone could have asked her, would it be more convenient if I got down on your level, or if I crouched down or sat next to you in a chair? But they didn't ask, and so she used her voice to express what she wanted. However, that's just an aside, just to let you know that some people will speak up, and some people, when in doubt, as Marty said, the golden rule: ask. Just ask, because who knows, she might have been waiting all night for someone to ask her, would you mind if I sat down next to you so we could talk? Is that more helpful for you? So just sharing that. And I think about our office. We have I have a staff member who has cerebral palsy, and she can walk. And she does walk using crutches. However, as Marty explained, it is easier for her to get around our office, to get in and out from the parking lot, and to do the work she does in the community by using a power chair sometimes. So you can't judge, you can't assume. Again, going back to the monolith, what is true for one is not true for the other. Yet she is some days a wheelchair user and some days not. So, but she still has cerebral palsy, which is a significant disability, mobility disability. So
yeah. And I'll just echo that point Samantha was making of, so we're giving you some general guidelines to, arm you with as you go out to the world and are interacting with different kinds of people. But I cannot underscore enough, disability is not a monolith. It includes all kinds of different people with all kinds of different situations. And so while everything we're telling to you, it's probably going to be true for a majority of people with hearing loss, for example, the things we're going to talk about on this slide, just keep in mind it's probably not going to be true for everybody. So defer to asking anytime you're in doubt or have a question. A really important part of the philosophy at our office is that we position people with disabilities as the best experts on what they need and what is going to be helpful to them. The medical model that traditionally is kind of the approach we've taken in our country is to position medical professionals or academics as experts on disability, which is wild to me, to be honest, just because I feel like that's where we've gotten a lot of things wrong over the years, is we think we know best for people. So just consider the person you're interacting with as the expert of the best way to interact with them. And so don't hesitate to ask, is it helpful if I take a seat or whatnot? But so let's talk about people who are deaf or have hearing loss. I can tell you a large part of my work, I interact with a lot of deaf people in our community. And there are definitely some things that I had to learn throughout my experiences. So just a couple general tips. So first of all, be mindful of the sight line of the person. And so position yourself in front of the person you're interacting with. Be sure that you have their attention. So, it's common if I'm at a table with a bunch of deaf people that the hearing people or the interpreters in the room, they might, pound on the table a couple times to get people's attention. And that might seem rude to us hearing people, to bang on a table to get someone's attention. But it's important to make sure, they're looking at you if you're communicating something. Talk normally, like we've been saying with all, this is true of all disabilities, talk the same way you would with anybody, but be very direct and repeat or rephrase if necessary or if you're asked. And finally, this last one I think is the most important. Be mindful of the level of communication that is occurring. And so for very simple, low level interactions, that a sign language interpreter is not always needed. An example I'll use sometimes is, if a deaf person goes into Starbucks and they want to order a cup of coffee, that interaction can happen very naturally just by exchanging a few written notes. Or most of the deaf people that I know use their phones, a notes app on their phone to just type messages, and very commonly they'll hand it to you to read and then type your response. But all of that being said, if any kind of complex information is being relayed between you and the deaf individual, always hire an American Sign Language interpreter. I can tell you, so I've been taking sign language classes for about 3 years now. I've learned a lot. I still always hire a sign language interpreter. Mm-hmm. I think it's pretty common that someone, might have taken a couple years of sign language in high school, and they are emboldened to think that they can then act as an interpreter. Think about how that would work with other languages. I took a couple years of Spanish in high school and I'm not fluent, and I can say basic conversational type things, but I could not have an in-depth conversation about something. And so a kind of sign language basics a lot of times is just, finger spelling, and you can spell using the letters of the alphabet. That is not an effective way to have a conversation if you're spelling all of the words. And if you ever have a question about how do I hire a sign language interpreter or who do I call, you can reach out to us and we're happy to connect you. There's multiple companies actually that provide interpreters in the Charlotte area. Okay, so let's talk about language a little bit. This is a big deal, I feel like, and something that a lot of people can be understandably hung up on. So I find it most effective to just talk about it. On the left side of the screen is an image of a person wearing a white t-shirt that just says, "Disability is not a bad word." So I'll share some terms that I think it's better to avoid. Handicapped is the big one. And I know this is tricky because we've kind of been ingrained culturally to talk about, handicapped parking or whatnot. This is a word that is perceived to be insulting to some people with disabilities. They don't consider themselves to be handicapped. Similarly, along these same lines, any of the euphemisms that able-bodied people like to use, like handy capable or visually challenged instead of blind. This is a personal preference, of course, and I know people with disabilities who have different preferences, but I don't know anyone who likes these terms, visually challenged or handy capable. The next one, special, I think is probably one of the bigger ones, and it's difficult because We talk about special education. We have the Special Olympics. We talk about people with special needs. As someone who works on advocacy, the goal with all of my work is for people with disabilities to be treated equally. And so these two things are very much at odds. And sometimes, I'll have to have conversations with people that, you can choose to be special and fight to receive special treatment, or you can choose to be equal. The work that I do is with the goal of people being treated equally, but these are two ideas that are very much at odds. And to be clear, a lot of us with disabilities, our needs aren't special, they're just needs. And so, we all have needs. And so kind of singling out people with disabilities as their needs are extraordinary or special, or it's just like everybody else. So that's my rant on the term special. But like we talked about earlier, wheelchair bound or confined to a wheelchair are woefully inaccurate. Also saying, that someone's a victim of epilepsy or a victim of whatever the case may be, that kind of victim mentality is, we're not supporting each other as best as we could. We at our office, we view disability as it is a part of the human experience on this planet. And so, victim, it's not helpful. I'll say it that way. And then this one, I think most of us know at this point, but the term retarded is not in favor. The way we refer to, mental retardation these days in professional circles is generally intellectual disabilities. You might hear people say cognitive disabilities, or sometimes developmental disabilities. I'll say developmental disabilities encompasses quite a lot of things. The technical definition is a disability that is acquired either at birth, congenitally, or before the age of 21. And so I get a little sensitive personally when people use intellectual disabilities as a blanket term, and what they actually mean is an intellectual disability, because those are different things. And then finally, this last one is one of the newer ones that I've observed in my work. You can use mental illness, but I think it's a little more welcoming and inclusive to just refer to mental health issues. So that's our slide on language. And I'll end with this idea. I've thought about this a lot for myself, and I work with all kinds of people who use all kinds of ways that they refer to themselves and others. It is a very personal choice, what kind of label a person chooses to use for themselves. But at the end of the day, I think, the words that we choose to use is one of the simplest and easiest ways that we can be kind to each other. I'm generally not in the business of correcting people if they use some of these words that we suggest you don't. With older adults especially, they use the word handicapped when they call me and talk about parking, for example, and I tend to use the phrase accessible parking, but it's usually very readily apparent the intention behind the word someone's using, and unless it seems very clear that they are trying to be hurtful, I'm not going to make an issue of what word someone chooses. But it's a really, really easy way to be good to each other. So
Marty, real quick sorry to interrupt. We did have a question about language. So Cynthia asked, is it better to refer to someone as disabled versus handicapped?
So this is something I can tell you, I do observe very much kind of along generational lines. And so I know a lot of younger people with disabilities who come from a place of kind of taking back that term disabled, and they are very comfortable referring to themselves as disabled. This is not true for everybody. And personally, I switch back and forth all the time between saying person with a disability or disabled people. When you're talking to an individual, I'm going to go back to that golden rule. Just ask, how should I refer to you, or how do you refer to yourself? And they'll tell you very plainly if they would like to be called disabled or a person with a disability. And that's actually a perfect question, because I just wanted to run through real quickly on this side the difference between person first and identity first. And so I can tell you part of my academic background is I have a degree in disability studies. And this is person first language is something that was really pounded into us in a lot of our classes. And we would spend a lot of time practicing how to use person first language. I can tell you though, just what I've observed over the years is that this is something that is really important to a lot of well-meaning, able-bodied people who work with people with disabilities. I have found it to be less important to people with disabilities. So, take that for what it's worth. But if you're ever unsure, I will say err on the side of person first language, perhaps, just because you don't know how it might make that individual feel. So person first is probably going to be your safer bet. The idea there is that, it's a person with whatever the disability may be, as opposed to identity first is when you are centering the disability as the main describer of the person. So the examples here on this slide is you could be speaking about a person with autism. Autism is just one facet of who they are as a person. People with disabilities, like people without disabilities, we're all multifaceted people. So that's kind of the idea behind person first language. But I know plenty of people with autism who prefer to use identity first language and refer to themselves as autistic people. So both are perfectly acceptable is the point I'm trying to make. And like Samantha said earlier, ultimately it depends. And what it depends on is the person you're interacting with. So, err on being as respectful as possible and or just ask the person what their preference is.
Marty, if I can jump in and just give a little practical example of when we were interviewing someone for one of our peer mentor positions. She is a young woman who has had a disability all of her life. And she was explaining in the interview when this particular question, do you all use person first versus identity first language? And she kind of turned the tables on us and said, well, I struggled with person first, most of my life. She said, but, I've grown up with this disability. I am, a wheelchair user. I am, a person with a disabled person. It's part of me at age 22. So again, when in doubt, ask, have those conversations. And as Marty mentioned, it just depends. It really does who, if they're taking back or, using their identity as a piece of them versus, someone of another generation might be, want to refer to themselves as a person with a disability rather than a disabled person. But, we, as I mentioned early on, we have our staff is comprised of a variety of different persons with disabilities, and it just depends. So you ask the questions if they don't disclose. And so, she also runs some peer support groups. So part of that discussion is ongoing in the work that she does. She encounters a bunch of different people who refer to themselves in a variety of ways. So thanks for letting me jump in there.
Yeah, and I'll just add, and then we'll move on. I think the main idea between people who prefer this identity first language and refer to themselves very comfortably as a disabled person, the idea there is that they're not ashamed of having a disability. And it is a central part of their identity. And so, some of the thought process there, I believe, is that it's taking pride in this as part of who I am. And I don't feel funny about saying I'm a disabled person. So just some context.
Nichelle, I think there is a question. Did you want to read it? I think it goes with this this topic right now.
Yes. Let's see. Morris stated that he knows a person with a disability who prefers to be referred to as differently abled.
That's fine. That's that person's choice. Like we've said throughout, disability is not a monolith. And Absolutely. There are people who do like some of that more euphemistic language. I can tell you though, the people that have a problem with it's based on some very real concrete problems that are a really big deal to them. So if you know that a person prefers a term like differently abled, then by all means use that when you're speaking with them. But be really careful to be clear in your own mind, at least, of that's not going to be true of many other people, even if they have the exact same disability that that individual has. So I would only use that kind of language if you know without a doubt that that is what the individual prefers. So, and that's fine. I'm a big believer in, we all get to make choices, and especially when we're talking about how we refer to ourselves, that's a very personal choice and generally very layered. There's a lot of thinking that goes into why someone prefers what they prefer. So, I have no problem, and I respect people who prefer that terminology, but I would just caution you to not apply, their preference across the board. So I know very few people with disabilities who prefer to be called someone with special needs. So that's just my experience.
I think it's an interesting topic because I'm thinking of it from a work perspective. And so it is one thing when we're dealing with an individual on asking them how they would prefer to be referred to. But if you're doing a business document or a business communication, is there an underlying best practice? For example, even with writing the workshop description, it's like person with disabilities, or, how are we selecting our language when we're in a more formal setting?
Mm-hmm. And so I'll go back to, if you're ever unsure, or if you're trying to be as professional and respectful, or even, politically correct, I'll just say it, then by all means use person first language. I think that's the safest, least offensive option available to us so far. Language is always evolving. So my answer might be different 5 years from now, but for now, err on the side of person first language, which again is just person with a disability, or if you want to be more specific, person with autism or epilepsy or whatever the case may be. So that's the way to go, I would say, if you're concerned about the potential to possibly offend anybody, which most of us never want to do. So, and I know we're coming to an hour, and we do want to leave some time for more questions for sure. So I'm just going to talk about service animals for a minute. I'll give you the disclaimer that this is a full 60, 90-minute training that Samantha and I do all the time. There is a service animal, there's a lot to service animals, and there's a lot to be said. So I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. Here's the definition that is in the Americans with Disabilities Act. A service animal is a dog or miniature horse that has been individually trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. The task or tasks performed must be directly related to the person's disability. And so just some general interaction tips to know. It generally is not appropriate to pet or distract a service animal. I would say, even if you ask politely, for me, I don't even ask. I just respect that the animal is working. They're doing a very specific job. Again, like everything we're talking about tonight, this is going to vary from person to person. But why I err on the side of I don't even ask, and I'm a dog lover, to be clear, I'm always happy to pet a dog. But if, based on the person's personality, if they're a very social and outgoing person, generally that's going to extend to their service animal, most commonly a dog. And if they're someone who's happy for you to pet their animal, they'll just tell you, they'll make that very clear to you. And so, if they're not making a point on their end to say, go ahead and pet him, he's friendly or whatever, I can only imagine it gets very tiring to have to answer, can I pet your dog all day long when you're trying to just, live your life and get things done out in the world. Sometimes it can be helpful for some people to think of a service animal the same way you would think of a piece of equipment, a wheelchair, for example. So if you would not, when you are meeting someone who uses a wheelchair for the first time, ooh and ah over their wheelchair and just go on and on about how cute it is, don't do that with their dog. If you want to say like, nice dog, or acknowledge it, that's fine. But, making a big production out of it, I think it is, it's just tiring. So that's what I'll leave you with for service animals. But absolutely, if you have questions, feel free to ask them, because there's a lot to be said about service animals. And this image on your screen is just a golden retriever, it looks like, wearing a vest that says "Do Not Pet," and he is carrying a plastic grocery bag in his mouth.
All right, thanks, Marty. So just to kind of close us out on the formal presentation here, and then we'll take some questions, but y'all have had some wonderful questions throughout. We love questions. But so how can you learn more? This was a primer on disability awareness, but hopefully your key takeaways will be, just ask when in doubt and be respectful, and reach out to us, of course, if you have more detailed, specific, or case by case kind of interactions you want to run by us. As your Center for Independent Living, we are more than equipped, the staff, to troubleshoot, ask these questions. Marty, of course, being our advocacy guru, etc., on this stuff. But if you have an interest in how to learn even more after this presentation, we do have some things that we recommend. So Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist by the Judy Heumann. So she has written a book, she has a podcast, she has had just a prolific life in terms of independent living and the disability rights movement. So this being her most recent publication. And so Being Human, a wonderful book to read, download it, audio, etc. If you have ever seen the movie Crib Camp, Judy Crib Camp, A Disability Revolution, this was all the rage a couple of years ago, but as it should be, because it really did give so many people an insight into the struggles, the passion, the perseverance that Judy Heumann, along with other disability rights activists, paved the way for all of what is available to persons with disabilities now. So she is featured as a young woman fighting the fight in this movie. Of course, she went on to do many other activism initiatives out there. Demystifying Disability, What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally by Emily Ladau. She is pictured at the top of the page holding a copy of her book. Disability Visibility, another one, First Person Stories from the 21st Century by Alice Wong. And then down at the bottom is a picture of Alice Wong in her power chair along with Judy Heumann, the woman I mentioned earlier. So they are together in a photo on this slide. And then No Pity, People with Disabilities Forging a New Civil Rights Movement by Joseph Shapiro. This is a book that we make all of our staff read, our board of directors read. When I remember reading it and just being amazed by how much how little I knew until this gentleman presented his research and his interviews and case studies in such a way that, it read like a novel. It was just such a wonderful flow to it. So these are some things that we recommend. Of course, we also do ongoing trainings for churches, places of worship, schools, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, neighborhood meetings, groups, moms groups, etc. I mentioned the books, but definitely there are plenty of resources out there if you have any follow-up questions. Next slide. You are welcome to reach out to our agency. Marty and I have put our email up there on the screen. as well as the phone number for our agency. We have a newsletter that comes out every other month. So there is a place on our website. And at the, if you email us, we can add you to that list. As a neighborhood group, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that monthly we have an advocacy an advocacy council that meets, and it is made up of consumers. It is made up of ADA liaisons for the city, the county, businesses, etc. And so we provide trainings and technical assistance each month, and it is free. And there's always great discussion and great training. So through reaching us, you can plug into that schedule, their virtual meetings, of course, due to COVID. So that's all. Marty, did you have anything else to add before we take any questions? But thank you for your time, everyone. This has been a great group. It's an evening group and you ask questions, so I'm happy.
We do have a question from Cynthia. Do you have any of the tips you've provided available as a handout or link to a PDF?
That's a great question. Off the top of my head, no, although that's a good idea and I'm going to make a note of it. At this time, no, although, if you had any specific questions or wanted Samantha or I to kind of recap some of what we covered, we would be happy to get that to you. So, just send us an email and we'll get something together, but very good idea for moving forward. We might come up with a handout of some kind.
Would you all be willing to share the PowerPoint I can send as a PDF to the participants tonight with just the definitions? Is that something that we can do?
For this small of a group, I think we can share it with you all. So, this is just our packaged information from the expertise that we hold as an agency. But we never give legal and or medical advice. But yes, we could make that available to the participants for training purposes only, not to be reproduced. And I have to give the disclaimer as the director here, not to be reproduced or take it used as the Bible or the gospel here. But yes, that some people are visual learners, so I completely understand. But as Marty mentioned, it really does boil down to some common sense once you have an awareness and you're cognizant of how to interact. So when in doubt, ask, use your common sense, try not to be nervous. Marty, anything else you want to add? But helpful tips, I get it. It is important.
Do we have any additional questions? You can type them in the chat, or if you raise your hand, I can call on you and you can speak to the group. We know it's a lot of information and we really just scratched the surface. It's amazing what we don't know. And it's important for us to be proactive and learn this information because we're all touched by people with disabilities, whether we have one ourselves or a family member, people that we work with. And it's just important to really learn how to interact and just be inclusive in all the things that we do. So we're very thankful that you all joined us tonight. I'm not seeing any questions. If you all have questions later on, please feel free to reach out to Samantha and Marty, a wealth of knowledge, and we appreciate you being with us. Oh, here we go. What is the average hourly charge for interpreters?
That's a great question. And I know we keep saying this, but it depends. And so what it primarily depends on, just in the way I use interpreting services, is generally whether or not you're going to be going through a company that provides interpreters or hiring an individual interpreter directly. Those are both options that are available. If the cost is a real concern, you might want to think about hiring directly an interpreter because generally that's going to cost a bit less. Part of the reasoning though for that is that when you are going through a company that provides interpreters, there are a lot of safeguards that you're paying for. And so it can be helpful to think of it, it's almost like interpreter insurance. if you are, you're hiring an interpreter for an event 2 weeks out, and the individual who has been assigned to come be your interpreter has some kind of family emergency that day, and all of a sudden they're unavailable, then because you've used a company, they're going to be able to very quickly and seamlessly slide someone else in place of that person. So, pros and cons to both, I would say. But, if the time comes when you need to hire an interpreter and you want to just talk through it with someone, please give me a call and I'll tell you what my experience has been, and I can give you some recommendations or referrals for the companies in the Charlotte area, as well as individuals. I could give you that also. So
Just, I don't mind disclosing this, just because I sign off on, the POs for interpreting services. I mean, it runs depending on the two different scenarios Marty mentioned. It can run anywhere from, 75 for an hour of interpreting to 150, 200 for complex medical interpreting, etc. So, if I were young, I'd say that is a super great field to get into. It's very much appropriate and needed. That's the mom in me thinking in terms of a provider. But, I would say you do get what you pay for. You get the peace of mind if you go through a company. North Carolina, they do have to be certified interpreters here, right, Marty, for the state, licensed and certified interpreters here. Other places, they have different laws in place, but it is very rigorous, and they earn every penny of the money that they do. And in terms of accessibility and rights for the ADA, it's worth it and necessary. I can't stress it, right, Marty? Necessary to hire an interpreter to ensure effective communication.
yes, and thank you, Samantha, because I failed to say any numbers, and I know that's what the question was. So thank you. And yeah, I'll affirm, like, that range she said is exactly correct in my experience as well. That higher end, when you're getting up to 200, generally that's going to be, there are a couple different types of specializations and special certifications that interpreters can have. And so that higher end is going to be, for a courtroom interpreter, for example. They know high level legal terminology that, an interpreter in a school doesn't have any reason to know, the legal terms and whatnot. And same for healthcare. I think we can all relate to going to the doctor and they're saying, medical terminology to us, and we're just like, what? That's a high level of communication that people are specially trained to provide. So thank you, Samantha, for helping me out with that one.
No problem. No, thank you for taking that one. I will say another presentation, if there's more you want, Nichelle, for this group, or if the group wants, we do a thorough, just like Marty mentioned, service animals, always a interesting and robust presentation. The same as effective communication, why it's important, why it matters, and why it's necessary. So.
Awesome. Thank you. So again, if you all, especially, I know there's a couple of neighborhood leaders on the call tonight. If you all want these resources for your neighbors, your neighborhood, please just reach out. Like, this is what it's for, and we want to make sure that you all have the information that you need. I'm not seeing any additional questions. So I think that will conclude our presentation tonight. Thank you, Marty. Thank you, Samantha. And thank all of you for joining us. We so appreciate it. We are thankful that you took the time out. And if you have questions for me, if you all have suggestions for additional trainings that you want to see, regardless of topic, please shoot that to me. We'll do the research and we'll see what we can come up with. We are definitely here to serve you all. So with that, this will be recorded and available in about 2 weeks on our Training on Demand site. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Have a great night.
Thank you.